Thank you so much, Roger, for having us here on the Isle of Man in your workshop that you actually opened 20 years ago. What really fascinates you so much about watches?
I think for me it's the sort of mechanical side of it. I've always been interested in the mechanics of anything, really. At school I wasn't very switched on at all, really, but give me anything mechanical and there's natural sort of interest there. So I was, I suppose I was directed to it through my father. He was collecting a few clocks at the time and I became interested in the mechanics of those clocks. And then he directed me in the direction of a course in Manchester.
How was your way paved to George Daniels then? How did that connection came up?
Yeah, so he, I think I was in my second year on the horology course, and one day we were told that this man called George Daniels was going to come and visit us the following day. And we were told that this man made watches completely by hand. And of course, well, for me, the idea of making a watch by hand was just, how is that possible? So I didn't believe it until the next day.
Did you talk that night? Did you talk to him? And was there already a connection?
Yeah, so so on the day he arrived, and he took a tour around the workshops and met the students. And yes, I managed to speak to him, and I asked what was on the end of his pocket watch chain. And out came this pocket watch, the Space Traveller. Oh. And it was one of those sort of mind-blowing moments, really, that I kind of realised that I suppose, met genius. Especially when I realised, when it all clicked into place, and I realised that this man had made the complete watch, designed the watch, from the basic raw materials.
Let's go back to the watches you designed to apply to work for George Daniels.
First pocket watch I made, I started when I was 19 years old, and I finished it 18 months later. And I was working out of a small workshop in my parents' garage at home, and I made it. And so obviously the natural thing for me to do was to then contact George and ask if he'd look at it and maybe approve it, give me some advice. So showed him the watch, and he was anything but congratulatory. I mean, he, as he said, he said, look, you've managed to get a watch together that works, but the quality simply isn't there. You really need to go away and focus on these 34 different skills or trades which are traditionally used in the creation of a complete watch.
So
yeah,
we're terribly disappointed. I mean, it's 18 months. That's a long.
Yeah, it is. But I think I knew. I mean, for me, the goal was just to get a watch to work, and I did that. I remember the first time it ticked, and I was amazed it ticked. And I'd probably been working on the watch for a year at that point, maybe even longer. So that for me was the huge moment. And the components were made to us the only standard I knew at the time, really. I mean, it was appalling looking back. It was a bit of a mess, but anyway, for me, it was the ticking. And actually, that's what George said. He said, look, at least you now know you can make a watch that works. Put it to the back of your bench and start again. And then it kind of cleared it for me, my head. I was very happy.
You were motivated.
Yeah. I mean, I started the next watch completely afresh, and I was just really keen with every single part I made, desperately keen to improve it, and I didn't, I just kept making those parts again and again and again until I could see improvements in that sort of second watch.
And how long did that watch take?
So the second one took 5.5 years. And wow. That was just because of this sort of, I knew I was improving all the time, and I think I made the watch within a year, the first watch, and it's working, and it is much better than the first watch.
Yes.
But then I look back at the components I'd made earlier that year, and they're of a far poorer quality than what I was making just that week. So I'd go back to the beginning and remake those, and then go through the whole watch, remaking all the bits. And that process went on for, as I say, 5.5 years.
You must have been so excited when you, after 5 years, showed this piece to George. This watch. I mean, could you describe that again?
We met George, went into his workshop. He grunted about on the way down there. He sort of said, "Why did you bring the first watch?" It was appalling, as he was. And, you know, I thought, oh, crikey, this isn't going well. But we got into the workshop, and I put the watch in front of him at his bench, and he looked at it, opened the box, he turned it round in his hand, he asked to see what was open the back of the watch. So he did, and he looked at the mechanism and turned it round in his hands, and then he started asking who made the various parts, you know. And I said I did to all of them, obviously. And then he snapped the back to, stood up, "Congratulations, you're a watchmaker." And that was amazing. That was, you know, sort of 7 years of, you know, bloody hard work, really, you know, to try and get to that point. And I didn't hear anything he said. He just carried on talking for probably, I don't know, it seemed like 10, 15 minutes. He was just walking around the workshop, and I can't remember a word he said. And that was it, really. That was an extraordinary moment.
Did he kind of call you afterwards and say, "Do you want to work with me together?" Because that is also a big step for him. He never had done that before.
Yeah. I remember one morning, the phone rang. I was still at my parents' house then. And it's George Daniels, and he was talking about this project that he'd been working on with Amiga. And it was all hush-hush at the time. They'd taken on his co-axial, and they were wanting to put his escapement into production. And as part of the arrangement, George was going to get some mechanisms, some movements, raw movements, and he wanted to create a series of watches around that movement. He thought about maybe, I think he said about 10 or so pieces. And would I be willing to move over to the Isle of Man to work with him for a year on that project? And so, yes, straight away, of course. You know, what else can you do?
It feels a little bit unusual as a 20-year-old to move to Isle of Man, because usually the people would rather move to London or somewhere, you know, like more lively areas. But for you, that was your goal.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't care. You know, the focus was learning about watchmaking. I mean, you know, it's just consuming my life. You know, for me, the challenge was to make a watch from start to finish. That was what I wanted to do. And George was my idol. I mean, he is regarded as the world's greatest watchmaker of his time.
Partly these machines come from George Daniels.
Yes, yeah, they do. So he found them, well, they're actually owned by a guy called Professor David Torrens, who worked at Trinity College in Dublin.
Oh.
And he was a real collector of horological tools. And these were in his collection, although part of the engine turning equipment was with him in Dublin, and the rest of them was sort of rusting away in a basement in Clerkenwell, London, which was an old watchmaking sort of sector.
So George was setting them up again and building them up to work.
Yes, exactly. Yes, so he sort of knew of them, and he, asked David Torrens if he, could take them off him, and he did. So, yeah, he had to sort of rebuild these bits of equipment and then teach himself how to use them.
They're so rare these days, huh?
Yeah, they are. Yeah. And these are over. George used to tell me they were about 200 years old, and still working well today.
I was reading something about George that said that he's sometimes, he always wanted to work in silence because distracting is terrible for somebody who's working so concentrated on something. Yeah. And he said that sometimes even the silence of the Isle of Man was too loud for him.
Oh, really?
Could you imagine that, or did you even have the same feeling that it sometimes was too loud to work in silence, so that silence becomes loud?
Well, I always like music, so I always sort of have music or noise in the background. Yeah. So yeah, I'm probably quite different than that. Actually, no, I've never heard that. Yeah. That's interesting to hear.
Thank you so much for now, and I would recommend that we now go into the workshop. So did he leave any drawings or any constructions that you found?
Yeah, so he did very few drawings, but I can show you some. So these are good examples as to how he would work. First of all, you would start off with the aesthetics of the watch. The most important feature of any watch is the dial, because that's what the client will be looking at day in, day out. So as you can see here, he's just trying out different ideas.
Yeah.
With this one, you have a temperature gauge and then a power reserve, and obviously minutes, hours and seconds.
You can definitely see that this is somebody who's not used to work on a computer, because his handwriting is so precise. Yeah. It's so different from our handwriting today.
Yeah.
When we commissioned this last article almost 10 years ago, he was referring, for example, for a watch that was about 80% ready. And I mean, what happened with the last pieces he was working on? Did you finish that?
So that one you're talking to is the unfinished watch. Actually, it's here at the moment, if you'd like to have a look at it.
So, Roger, this is actually the piece that George worked on when we interviewed him 10 years ago in the last interview.
That's right. Yeah. Yes.
And you call it the unfinished. I mean, it's unfinished, obviously, but where was it in the last decade, and why do you have it back here?
So it's been stored in, it's been on exhibition actually in the Science Museum in London, and it's been brought back here for me to have a look through and to try and work out if, a possible strategy in order to get the watch finished and up and running. That was always George's wish. He wanted to see it being completed. And so yes, it's been with me now for a couple of months, and I've been through the watch and written a report on the feasibilities of getting it up and running.
Idea or calculation on how long that would take to...
Well, that is the challenge. Again, it's it could be anywhere from 6 months to a year. It may be a bit longer.
Yeah.
It's so difficult because there are no designs to it. I mean, I've been through the mechanism and everything appears to be functioning correctly.
Yeah.
But the watch has never ticked, and that's the big problem.
Yeah.
Didn't George miss something out? Did he get a calculation wrong?
Yeah.
I just don't know, and that's why it's difficult for me to commit at the moment.
You were talking about the book you were learning from. You have that piece here?
Yes, the book, the watchmaking book over here.
So that is your learning book from George Daniels?
Yes. So this was given to me, I think when I was about 17, 18 years old by my father and mother for Christmas. Wow. And as you can tell, with the oily, greasy fingerprints all over it. But this I poured through many times. It's always on my bench, always open.
Yeah.
And I used to spend my time studying these images in great detail with eyeglasses. And
when was that published, actually? When was the first time that was published?
I think in the 80s. Okay. Yeah, I think in the 1980s. I'd have to check.
It was exactly the lowest point of interest in watchmaking and mechanical watchmaking. Huh?
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly after the quartz crisis, George brought this book out.
Yeah, well, George had this thing, I think, incredible vision for watchmaking.
Yeah.
And he wanted to, he believed that mechanical watches should be around forever.
Yeah.
And he didn't understand the quartz crisis. As far as he was concerned, the quartz was destroying his trade that he loved.
Yeah.
And so this is why he focused on trying to improve the mechanical timekeeper and started writing his books on watchmaking.
How do you restaurate something that you know that one man did by his hands, you know?
Well, I mean, they need very little work.
Yeah.
You know, so I serviced the Space Traveller, which was for me a fantastic experience, considering that was the first watch I'd seen of George's. And it was a breathtaking watch, and actually stripping the watch down and studying it, and you kind of really got to appreciate what a genius the man was. You know, the technical achievements that went into that particular watch were just outstanding, never been seen before.
Thanks so much.
Pleasure.
And cannot wait to see now, the house.
George's place.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
So George had that building, he had that built in I think prior to him arriving here. So he had some work done on the house, and he had that workshop built, and is purposely done to house his watchmaking. So now it's a guest house.
Okay.
Or, you know, sort of like what we call a granny flat.
Okay.
So yeah, it's all purpose built. All the main watchmaking benches were down, you know, this sort of side of the building to get the maximum light. And
so the main house was mainly for living.
It was, yeah.
You know what was there after his death then, the first time? Like, what was it, empty and sold, or just?
So George had a big car collection.
Yeah.
He had watches, he had a couple of properties. So everything was sold, and everything was then put into the George Daniels Educational Trust.
Ah, okay.
Which was set up to help and assist students to get into watchmaking. But actually George's ashes are scattered below that cherry tree there.
No, not true.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Was that his last? Was it his last wish?
Yeah. So that tree was given to George by a lady called Tina Miller, who again has recently passed away. And she was, she used to work with George. She was his secretary at Sotheby's, and you know, formed this great friendship. And I think it's George's 70th birthday. She presented him with that cherry tree. She, you know, brought the plant over, and that was his birthday present. So he, we said he wanted to be buried there. So, well, his ashes were scattered.
Yeah. Do you know, did he tell you what he would like to have evolved his legacy, in which direction?
Well, I mean, the handmade watch was always his thing. That was the thing. But you know, he used to come round to the workshop after I'd left him and set up the new workshop, and even when we bought the first CNC piece of equipment, you know, he's really fascinated by that.
Yeah.
And I think George being George, he would have embraced it. He'd have embraced the technology.
Yeah.
And actually that's evident in the way he worked, because when he first had ideas to make watches, he made friendship with this guy called David Torrens, this Professor David Torrens. And he went to speak to him about what sort of equipment would be needed to set up to make his own watches. And obviously this Professor Torrens introduced him to the 17th century, 18th, 19th century pieces of equipment, but at the end of it, George decided that that wasn't for him. You know, he wanted to be making new watches. And so he went out and bought pieces of equipment like the Shogun 70 and modern-ish lathes and pantographs and so on to help him make those, because, you know, already he was obviously seeing that he could do things better and easier by using more modern equipment. So based on that, I believe that he would have certainly have gone down the CNC route had he been around and had he had the energy and capacity to take it forwards.
So George Daniels was a true master watchmaker who never actually completed a formal education. Yet, nonetheless, he pushed the boundaries of mechanical watchmaking to an extent that had not been seen since perhaps Abraham Louis Breguet. Daniels completed a mere 37 mechanical masterpieces throughout his lifetime. Left to his own devices, he trained himself in all 34 trades needed for that. But more than that, Daniels is today a role model for what people can achieve when they do believe in themselves.